Hi everyone. So in the blood vessel lab, we have a few number of objectives. So first is to identify arteries, next is veins, macroscopically on models. Then we're asking you to identify them via microscopically, not just artery, vein, and nerve, but also the layers of the walls of these blood vessels. To be able to give the flow of blood from one blood vessel to the next, key terms, and then prefixes, suffixes. Now, as far as the lab manual goes, I'll go in the opposite direction. The prefixes, suffixes, key terms are really well defined in there, as well as the microscopic images are labeled really well. So I'll leave those to the lab manual. You'll just need to scroll down toward the bottom of that document. However, I wanted to go over with you the different blood vessels and the flow of blood, because I think it'll be a little bit easier for you to understand via PowerPoint versus just looking at model images. So let's do that right now. Okay, so our main circulatory routes are systemic circulation, the hepatic portal circulation, our pulmonary circulation. Then we also have a fetal circulation, which is a little bit different than in the adult. We'll touch on that here. And then we'll talk about it again when we get to the end of this course in development. Okay, so first we'll talk about arteries. Now, one of the big things to remember that arteries, the way the arteries are defined, is they take blood away from the heart. Okay, remember that A for away. Arteries are taking blood away from the heart. Now, it is true that in most cases, arteries are carrying oxygenated blood. However, when the arteries are taking blood away from the heart to the lungs, they are carrying deoxygenated blood. Okay, so that's the tricky circuit. The pulmonary circuit is going to be a little bit tricky because, again, arteries taking blood away from the heart to the lungs are going to be deoxygenated and color-coded blue. And then veins actually coming back to the heart from the lungs are going to be oxygenated. Okay, that's, again, the color sort of on those is reversed. So just don't let that trip you up. Just always remember, arteries away, veins are taking blood toward the heart. Okay, let's start with the main artery that's taking blood away from the heart and out to the body, and it's the aorta. Now you'll see a few terms for the aorta. You'll have the ascending arch of the aorta, descending aorta, thoracic aorta, abdominal aorta. So they are all part of this one large blood vessel. It's just more a descriptive term of where they are. So right here in this image, you can see the heart is right here. It's been removed in this left-hand side. However, as blood is pumped by the heart, it's going to move up, right? So it's moving up here. So it's considered the ascending aorta. Then there's this arch, this curve. So that's simply called the arch of the aorta. And then blood is going to start moving down, right? Down the aorta, down here. So it's considered descending aorta. Now, when the aorta is in the chest, the descending aorta is sometimes called the thoracic aorta. And when the descending aorta is in the abdominal area, it's also called the abdominal aorta. So don't let that confuse you. It's just telling you where it's located. Now, one of the interesting things about the heart is that the blood that the heart is pumping, like inside the chambers of the heart, it can't actually absorb any oxygen or nutrients from the blood inside the chambers. It actually has to be fed by a whole bunch of different blood vessels. So I like this image because you can see part of the pulmonary trunk is removed, and that lets us see the left coronary artery. And they do a pretty good job, I think, of letting you see the different coronary arteries, even as they wrap around the heart or are covered by other structures or blood vessels. I also liked this branching tree here, so you can see the ascending aorta. There's a left coronary, I went the wrong way. There's a right coronary artery and left coronary artery. The right coronary artery will then branch into the posterior interventricular branch as well as the marginal branch. So it lays out the flow of blood very well for you, right? So visually, so again, here's the ascending aorta. We'll see that the right coronary artery is coming here. There is the marginal branch right here. And if we continue, it's wrapping around the back. So this part's actually wrapping around the back. and here's the posterior interventricular branch. Now on the other side, left coronary artery then branches into the anterior interventricular branch, as well as the circumflex branch. So a lot of these names are just descriptive. So you can see the left coronary artery coming this way. It branches here in the front. It's in the front, so it's anterior. It's actually in between the ventricles, so it's interventricular branch. And then this part that curves around and flexes around is called the circumflex branch. The subclavian branches, there's a little bit of a difference between the right side and then the left side. So hopefully you can see this in this image. Again, here we're at the arch of the aorta right now. This first branch off the aortic arch is called the brachiocephalic trunk. It will eventually give rise to the right common carotid and the right subclavian vein. The next branch off the arch of the aorta is the left common carotid artery, and then the left subclavian artery. So these two are split. They have their own independent branches off the arch of the aorta, whereas the ones on the right side have a common pathway called the brachiocephalic trunk, or sometimes it's called the brachiocephalic artery. Either term is okay. So what you're seeing here is written in the bullet points is the subclavian artery as it's passing superiorly to the first rib, so above the first rib. There's another branch called the vertebral artery, and that will eventually go into the brain, into something called the circle of Willis. We'll see that in a bit. Otherwise, the subclavian branch will continue into this armpit area right here, which is called the axillary artery. That will continue into what's known as the brachial artery. And then the brachial artery will split into the radial and ulnar arteries. Now this part's true on left and right sides. The common carotid is going to also branch. You're going to have an internal and then an external carotid artery, and this is true on left and right sides. The internal carotid artery is also going to contribute to the circle of Willis along with that vertebral artery that we mentioned a little earlier. Otherwise, it's also supplying parts of the eyes as well as parts of the brain. And this is the image of that circle of Willis. It's there to make sure that you see the vertebral artery coming in down here at the bottom, going into that circle of Willis. It's going to be particularly important. This is where your pituitary is going to be located, so you have lots of blood flow, making sure that hormones are being taken into circulation, as well as making sure that if there is a blockage anywhere, your brain is not completely deprived of oxygen. As we know, strokes are a very big deal and can be, fatal, right? So you definitely want to make sure there's backups in blood flow to the brain. Okay, so here we're looking at the aorta. I'm focusing in on that. So again, ascending aortic arch, descending aorta, or as we call it here, the thoracic aorta. You see that term here in the image. And then here it's the abdominal aorta until it splits. That's what you're seeing right here. And you'll notice there's quite a few branches coming off that abdominal aorta. The very first branch, I don't know how well you'll see this in this image. Hopefully you can see it clearly. Is something called the celiac trunk. So again, it's going to be this short, it's really not very long at all, short artery that's coming off the abdominal aorta, and almost immediately it's going to split and go in 3 different directions. So you can see 1, 2, and then it's going this way 3, and then even those branches will branch some more. This first one, which goes sort of superiorly, is going to be the gastric artery. The one that's going out toward the spleen, pretty much going toward that left side, out toward the spleen, is called the splenic artery. And then the one that's going to the right is called the hepatic artery. Now so that's this on this middle picture here. That's what you're seeing here. This top sort of nub is going to be that celiac trunk and those 3 branches. The next main branch off the abdominal aorta, and you can see all these organs that it's connecting to, is something called the superior mesenteric artery. So again, the next branch off the abdominal aorta is a superior mesenteric artery. Now, just kind of staying with this cluster, there is going to be renal arteries, which are not shown on these images, but kind of mirroring, excuse me, the superior mesenteric artery is this last branch off the abdominal aorta, which is called the inferior mesenteric artery. So again, you can see it coming off right here, right before that abdominal aorta splits. And then it's going into parts of the colon. I'm just going to go back up to this image just briefly so you can see this again. So here is the diaphragm. Again, that's what's going to separate our thoracic area from our abdominal area. This first branch is going to be that celiac trunk. This next branch is the superior mesenteric artery. And then what you're seeing here, this one right here, and then this one coming off here, these two larger arteries coming off the sides, that is the right renal artery and then the left renal artery. Below those will be the gonadal arteries, both left and then right. And you'll notice here on the images, they're either going to a testicle or an ovary, depending on the individual. And then here's that inferior mesenteric artery. And again, that's that last main branch off the abdominal aorta before it's going to split to take blood to our left and right leg. Okay, so let's just talk about those arteries of the lower extremity real fast. Again, I like this flow chart. It helps with how blood is flowing. So here we have the abdominal aorta, and you'll notice because of the complexity, they just did it on the one side, but it's the same on the other leg as it is on, the opposite side. So this very first split, so right up here, those splits are called common iliac arteries. Now, if you're on the right side, it's the right common iliac. If you're on the left, it is the left common iliac artery. Then that iliac artery will also split. There's a branch that goes external or out to the leg, and then internal, which stays sort of in that lower abdominal pelvic cavity area. If it is going external, it is called the external iliac. If it is staying internal, it is called the internal iliac. And again, you would specify whether that's on the right side or the left side. That external iliac will continue on as the femoral artery, again, right or left. As it goes behind the knee, if you remember back to your regional terminology, the posterior part of the knee is called the popliteal area. So it's simply the popliteal artery, again, left or right. That popliteal artery splits, and basically one branch goes toward the front of the tibia and one's going on the back of the tibia. The blood vessel in the front is simply called the anterior tibial artery. The one in the back is your posterior tibial artery. That posterior tibial artery will also branch into the fibular artery, again, right, left. And then that right anterior tibial artery will continue down into the dorsalis pedis artery in the dorsal part of the foot. And that's as far as we have you learn these, but you can see it continues down to an arcuate, metatarsal, and dorsal digital one, so it goes into the metatarsals, into the toes. As well as into the plantar area, the bottom of the foot. Okay, so that covered pretty much the arteries. So again, the blood vessels that are taking blood away from the heart. Now we need to talk about the veins that are returning blood back to the heart. Okay, and you can see here, venous blood drains to either the superior or inferior vena cava or the coronary sinus. So the coronary sinus would be the blood that the blood that went to the heart now returning back to be pumped into the lungs. Okay, so let's take a look at the veins of the head and the neck. So we have an external and internal jugular. So you can see that the internal jugular is very large, whereas the external jugular is very small. Quite a bit of a difference between the two. And this is a bit of a profile, so depth is a little bit difficult, but external is much more superficial and internal is going to be deep, which is good because this is a fairly large blood vessel, so you want it well protected by muscles and things, and other, tissue. But you can see the internal jugular vein is draining blood from the brain area and in parts, the internal parts of the face, whereas the external is draining blood from the face and head, the superficial portions. And these are all returning to where the subclavian vein is and back into this right brachiocephalic vein. So what we'll also see is there'll be a mirror naming of veins as they were to the arteries. There'll be some differences, like jugular instead of carotid. However, for the most part, if we have a subclavian artery, we have a subclavian vein. You saw brachiocephalic artery, we have brachiocephalic vein. One difference will be that we do have two brachiocephalic veins, not just one. Okay, let's take a look at the arms and the leg. So we'll go in the flow of blood. Again, remember now everything is going back toward the heart. So the radial vein and the ulnar vein are on the same side as those bones. They are going to drain into the brachial vein, which will go into the axillary vein, which will go into the subclavian vein, back into the brachiocephalic vein, which will go into the superior vena cava. Now, as far as the leg goes, very similarly, we'll have a femoral vein that drains into an external iliac vein, into a common iliac vein, into the inferior vena cava. And you'll note in this picture, just like the arteries, we have an external iliac and an internal iliac vein. Oh, one other one of note, there's one called the great saphenous vein. That is a very large vein that goes all the way down toward the ankles. That's what the great means. It's just really long. And so you can see that's very medial and actually a fairly superficial vein that's joining back up with the femoral vein to form that right external iliac vein in this image. Now, I mentioned the hepatic portal system. This is very important, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in lecture when we get to, and even in lab when we get to the digestive system. But basically, much of the food that is being digested and absorbed first goes through the liver for processing. This is going to be really important to help store or modify nutrients or help detox things that might have gotten into your system. Whether that is some sort of toxin or, plant toxin or, alcohol, anything like that. So what you see is all of these veins coming from small and large intestine as well as stomach. They are all going into this one vein, which will then take blood through the liver for processing before it eventually goes into the inferior vena cava. And that's what this is showing you. So again, parts of the pancreas, the stomach, large intestine, small intestine are all going to join up into this hepatic portal vein to take the blood through the liver back to the inferior vena cava, back to the heart. Now I mentioned to you the pulmonary circulation. So again, it's going to be a little bit different and the color coding is different here. So what you're looking at, so here's our superior vena cava. This is the inferior vena cava. As you can see, blood is being taken back toward the heart, going through the right atrium, right ventricle, and now because it's going away from the heart, that is the pulmonary trunk. It is an artery, but it is blue because the blood is deoxygenated. It is going to the lungs to pick up oxygen. So anything you see blue in the lungs are arteries. So they're picking up oxygen. They're becoming red in color to denote that. They're coming back to the left side of the heart, left atrium, left ventricles, and then leaving through the aorta. So this is one case where, again, here the red in the lungs, these are veins that are taking blood back to the heart. Now I mentioned to you fetal circulation is going to be a little bit different than adult circulation. This is because the lungs of the fetus do not work. The fetus is not actually breathing inside the amniotic sac. It's getting all of its oxygen, nutrients, everything from the placenta, which essentially acts like its lungs. It's the site of gas exchange. So that means that the heart has I should say the pulmonary and systemic circuits have some bypasses so that we are not sending blood to lungs that are not yet developed and basically wouldn't be able to support, the flow anyway. So what you see here, and then plus we also have to send it back to the placenta and from the placenta. So as blood is coming from the placenta, right, it's going through the liver, and that's the very first duct. It's something called the ductus venosus, right? And that's this duct that goes through the liver. So the liver is not processing this blood. It's simply a highway through the liver so it can get back to that inferior vena cava and back to that right atria. So that's that ductus venosus. In the adult, it becomes simply a ligament. It very quickly collapses at birth. It becomes a ligament that we still see in adults in the adult liver. Once it's in the right atrium, there's another bypass here, which is called the foramen ovale. So foramen, if you remember back to 201, is a hole. It's simply an oval-shaped hole that is going to take the blood from the right atrium straight into the left atrium. Remember, you're not interested in sending blood to the lungs, so you might as well send it back into circulation. That foramen ovale becomes the fossa ovalis, so fossa like a divot. So again, at birth, it quickly closes, separating the two chambers. As the blood gets put into the left atrium, left ventricle, and it's going out the aorta, let me say that again. As some of this blood doesn't make it over to that side, but actually continues on the right side, so right atrium, right ventricle, into that pulmonary trunk, there is yet another shunt away from the lungs, because again, we don't want the blood going to undeveloped lungs. This is called the ductus arteriosus. There's actually a duct here, so it connects the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. So again, blood can flow straight into that descending aorta. That, again, quickly collapses at birth and becomes something called the ligamentum arteriosum. So again, yet another way to bypass the lungs. And then you'll see here there's umbilical veins that quickly will collapse after the umbilical cord is cut, as well as umbilical arteries, and they also will become ligaments, basically connective tissue, shortly after birth. This is just another version of what I had mentioned to you, another kind of way to take a look at how blood is being bypassed, or how the lungs are being bypassed. Okay, I think this covered the major structures for this section. Please let me know if you have any questions.